When dealing with the various sex worker collectives, a lot of progressives tend to start from an assumption that any kind of workers' organisation must be a good thing. But as history shows, an organisation which passes itself off as being for the workers could actually be one of the most important groups propping up a regressive regime. And I say that as a lifelong trade union activist. An obvious example is the Loyalist movement in Northern Ireland. That's about as grassroots and working class as you'll get. But it's also the main reason why that part of the world has been stuck in a violent quagmire for the last 50 years. Then there was the Union of Democratic Miners, who carried on working during the strike of 84-5 in Britain. Or I could mention the trade union which existed in Franco's Spain. Yeah, he had his own trade union, the OSE, which enlisted millions of members and negotiated on their behalf. So, although the wages and safety conditions were rubbish, they did have a job for life with a guaranteed pension. And it was the OSE which made sure those pensions kept up with the cost of living. In other words, it did indeed try to improve things for the workers, but the significant point is that it did so strictly within the limits of the existing system. And that's exactly what these sex worker collectives do. So as a result, they not only don't acknowledge the broader context in which prostitution takes place, by which I mean the power imbalances built into a capitalist system, but they end up actively supporting the exploitation which that system creates. After all, they define themselves as an organisation which fights for people's right to be a sex worker, so obviously they could never accept that sex work is inherently degrading and an expression of social inequality. So instead they take the only other option, which is to actively defend the idea that being a sex worker can be a career choice. In other words, they end up helping to make the sex industry seem like any other legitimate business. Or, to take another example, consider the miners who blow the tops off mountains. Obviously, their union is going to try to minimise the environmental damage which is caused by the mining companies, and it'll always be ready to supply an ordinary miner who'll tell the cameras how devastated he'd be if he lost his job. Which raises the question, what should be our attitude towards people whose work is mountaintop removal? I'd sum it up as, sorry, but what you're doing is antisocial, so even if for some reason you don't mind getting black lung, we as a society want what you're doing to cease. Then obviously we make that as easy as possible by helping them find alternative work, etc. But anyway, what all this comes down to is that just because someone can get together a couple of hundred workers, it doesn't necessarily mean they're the good guys, or that what they say is the best way forward. It's much better to judge them by the practical effects of their actions, and if the main effect is to help normalise the sex industry, then it's maybe time to look behind the simple label of Sex Workers Collective. So, to take a practical example, consider the advice given to sex workers on occupational hazards by the Scarlet Alliance in Australia, and you can check out the low bar for more details on this. A typical piece of advice would be telling a receptionist that when a punter phones a brothel, she should try to find out if he's violent or if he's with other men. But there's no indication on how she's meant to do so, given that the punter is on the far end of a phone line. In other words, they're just going through the motions of giving advice to cover up the fact that there isn't any effective way to reduce most of the dangers inherent in sex work. Equally, in a publication called 9 Lives, the practical advice comes down to things like, use your intuition to suss out a client, or, if attacked, defend yourself with your stiletto, or even a pen. So imagine if a union that organised factory workers told them to use their intuition to find out if a piece of machinery was dangerous, or maybe fix it themselves using their shoe, or a pen. That's not advice, it's wishful thinking. And of course sex providers should be offered as much info as possible, not to mention free condoms, rape alarms, etc., to minimise the dangers they face. But what's not on is when these collectives act as if their advice can reduce the dangers to a level where sex work becomes just another reasonably safe job. Which is exactly what I mean when I say that sex worker collectives should be judged by the practical effects they have, not by how they choose to describe their activities, given that much of the advice they supply isn't actually capable of ending the serious dangers inherent in the sex industry. The collectives do recognise the existence of a problem, but then they pretend it can be removed by a few reforms and by an adjustment in the worker's attitude. It's like putting an elastoplast on a serious wound, then saying, problem solved, move on. Except that problem's not solved. In fact, it's actually harder to solve that problem now, because before we can start to argue for a real solution, i.e. reducing the demand for prostitution, we have to spend time explaining that their phony solution hasn't solved the problem already. So Scarlet Alliance, far from being part of the solution, ends up being part of the problem. Some of its members may be genuine, or maybe they were originally, but the fact that they're unwilling to acknowledge the level of violence inherent in paid sex means that they end up painting themselves into a corner until they've effectively become apologists for the sex industry. Well, what else can you call them when they're willing to minimize the dangers which women face every day, including serious crimes like rape or assault, by describing them as just another occupational hazard, for which they then prescribe the kind of advice which doesn't even start to solve the problem. I'll tell you what, there's one thing I wouldn't call them, and that's a genuine trade union fighting to improve things for the workers.